Okay, is there any board questions for Joya on public affairs? Hearing none. I do have some news and recognition. I do want to recognize Joya. This will be her last meeting with us and our board. She has accepted a promotion in the office of the governor. So big congrats to her and me personally as the chair of this particular committee. Joya, you've been wonderful in helping me better understand everything that's related to public relations at the CSLB. So I do appreciate you and thank you. Thank you. And hearing that, I think there's no other board comment. Is there any other public comment, Shelley?
Not seeing any requests.
Hearing none.
Stand by. We do have one from Josh Buswell Charcow, and I've sent the request to unmute your microphone.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I just sent a message to Public Affairs. We have one of our members who has been trying to call in, and the access code on the agenda is not working. I tried it earlier myself, and it isn't working. Could someone send me an access code that does work? Or
I will send you the WebEx connection information in the chat.
Okay. Is there a way to call in or
there is. I'll give you that information as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you and Chair Granzilla. That concludes the Public Affairs Program update.
Thank you, Michael and Joya, for the presentation. So it is now 11:01, and I think we should take a break at this point. We will take a 10-minute break, and we will be calling roll call at 11:10 for board members to be back online, and we will continue with the meeting. Thank you.
Before we go, I do have my hand up. I don't think Shelley saw it. I just wanted to take a moment of personal privilege and to also thank Joya for her time in her position. When I was chair of public affairs, she helped me tremendously. And I just wanted to congratulate her and say thank you for her time. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. All right, see you back in now 9 minutes. Thank you. So Shelley, are you back?
I am.
Oh, good. And Mariah, are you on?
I am.
Very good. So let's see if we can do a roll. Here.
Frank Altamura.
Here.
Rodney Kobos, excused absence. David De La Torre.
Here.
Miguel Galarza.
Here.
Don Geritano.
Here.
Alan Guy. Diana Love.
Here.
Michael Mark. Steve Pinelli. Jim Ruane.
Here.
Johnny Simpson.
Here.
Mary Teichert. We have a quorum.
So moving on to legislation, which begins on page 223. I turn it over to our legislative chair, Jim Ruane.
Thank you, Chair Granzella. We will begin the legislative agenda with item number 1, Accomplishments and Activities Report. First, I'd like to highlight some legislative achievements for the calendar year 2021. The 2021 Accomplishments and Activities Report was provided to you as a separate publication with this meeting's board packet. Legislative staff was able to successfully ensure the passage and enactment of 2 CSLB-sponsored bills in 2021. AB 246, which made the illegal dumping of construction debris a cause for license discipline, and AB 569, the bill that increases the maximum civil penalties CSLB can assess for law violations to modern day costs. Staff was also directly involved in other measures by providing technical assistance on the bills that resulted in the restitution fund at CSLB and the bill that increased CSLB's application and license fees to address the board's structural budget imbalance. I'd like to congratulate the legislative staff. Great work for 2021. And now we'll get on to the legislative update. Item 2A, update on previously considered 2021-2022 pending legislation. Beginning on page 229 of your packet, this section of the agenda is an update for the board on two bills that the CSLB has already acted on. The first is AB 646. This bill would provide contractors whose licenses were revoked for a criminal conviction that is later expunged can provide that expungement for CSLB so that it may be reflected in the license record as appropriate. The board has support positions on this bill from 2021. I refer to Chief Legislation Mike Jamnetsky to provide any information or updates for the board on this bill. Mike, do you have anything?
Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair. As Mr. Ruane stated, the board supported this over a year ago, which is why it's here. We haven't heard about it. It stayed in the Assembly appropriations last year and moved to the Senate in January. So we just wanted to update you that it's moving again and remind you of the board's position from last March. At the time the board supported it, there was a fee to charge the licensee for this expungement service of $50. That has now dropped to $25. So we just wanted to update you to the minor change and tell you that board staff intend to continue to communicate the board's support position unless there's any concerns about that. Mr. Committee Chair, that is the update.
Great. Thank you, Mike. This is a status update only. No further action is required from the board at this time. But before we move on, do board members have any comments on this item? Seeing none. Shelley, anything from the public?
Not seeing any requests for this item.
All right, thank you. Our next item on page 231 is an update on Senate Bill 216. The CSLB sponsored bill would require C8 concrete, C20 HVAC, and D49 tree service contractors have a certification of workers' compensation insurance on file with the CSLB in the first year and for all contractors after 3 years. The board has a support position on this bill. Chief, do you have any updates for us on this?
Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair. 3 updates for the full board about the CSLB sponsored workers' compensation bill. We did report these updates at the January Legislative Committee meeting. So there's a change to the fiscal impact that the board reported last year. It's gone up about 30 or 40% because of the licensing fee increase for renewals. So this fiscal is based on really the speculation that some licensed contractors may not renew their license as opposed to having to get workers' comp. It's guesswork, but it's a possible concern. That's where the fiscal comes from. And we just wanted to report that it's gone up a little bit, well, significantly because of the fee increase. But again, it's really difficult to predict exactly how the population will react. The second update for the board is to the possible amendments to this bill that are described in the packet. Industry requested an amendment to the bill that would make it clear that a joint venture licensed by CSLB can still obtain the workers' comp exemption. The idea being that the 2 licensed entities that form the joint venture, routinely one of those licensees has workers' comp for the employees. So it would exempt the joint venture in those scenarios, but the bill will still provide that if the joint venture decides to be the employer, they will still have to get workers' comp. There's other technical amendments that I can answer any questions about. And those amendments are not in print, but they've been submitted. And finally, this Senate bill will not likely be heard in the Assembly until it gets a little bit closer to summer. That is the update on the board-sponsored workers' compensation bill. Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair.
All right, thanks, Mike. Status update only. Once again, no further action is required from the board at this time. But do we have any comments from board members or questions? Okay, seeing none. Anything from the public, Shelley?
Nothing from the public on this item.
Thank you. Our next item, 2B, review, discussion, and possible action on 2021-2022 pending legislation. We are now on page 234. As you know, CSLB legislative staff go through all the bills that are introduced or amended each and flags the measures that affect the board or that the board may wish to take a position on. Sometimes the legislature acts on those measures before the board has an opportunity to weigh in, which the board procedural manual has a process for addressing. We will discuss two of these measures shortly. First, let's move to AB 1733 on page 234. This bill would authorize state agencies like the CSLB to hold public meetings remotely as long as one physical location is provided that the public can access to observe the meeting remotely. Mike, will you provide us an update regarding this item?
Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair. The bill is still located where indicated in the packet. It's been referred. So as you know, our board meetings have mostly been over teleconference the last couple of years rather than in person. This bill would basically change the statutory definition of the word meeting for the purposes of Bagley-Keene to include teleconference. And it provides some procedures for allowing teleconference meetings to be held with specific requirements as described in the bill. Not much other than that to add to what's in the packet, Mr. Committee Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mike. The staff recommendation is that the board support this bill. This would include the authority for staff to communicate this position in written letters and public testimony. At this time, I'll entertain a motion and a second.
Mark.
Second.
Dave. Did you get that, Chair? Michael Marks and I believe it was John Giartano.
Was it Don or Dave?
Dave Delator, were you the second?
Sure.
I think Mr. De La Torre might have been first.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a race to the finish, I suppose.
Really?
Okay. You have that, okay.
And Dave De La Torre second. Thank you.
Good. Anything on the question for the board? Any board comment on this? Okay, Shelley, any public comment?
Any requests for this item?
Okay, Mariah, will you please call the roll?
Aye.
Frank Altamura,
Aye.
Rodney Kobos, excused absence, David De La Torre, Miguel Galarza, John D'Aretano, Alan Guy, Diana Love,
Aye.
Michael Mark, Steve Pinelli,
Aye.
Jim Ruane,
Aye.
Johnny Simpson, Mary Teichert.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Next is the AB 1747 on page 236. The CSLB sponsored bill increases the administrative fines for a licensed contractor's failure to comply with building permit requirements as well as other health and safety requirements. As the board packet indicates, staff worked with the board chair and I to submit a support letter to the legislature. Mike, please provide us an update on this.
Thank you to Mr. Committee Chair and Ms. Board Chair for helping staff get the support letter out in time for the Policy Committee hearing yesterday. As the packet indicates, there was a hearing and I did testify in support of our CSLB sponsored permit bill, and I'm pleased to announce it was passed out of the Policy Committee and onto appropriations. And also a special thanks is due to Mr. Board Member Michael Mark for helping staff get the word out on this bill. Thank you so much. And back to you, Mr. Committee Chair.
Thank you, Mike. This item, once again, is an update only. No action is required of the board. The board have any comments or questions? Seeing none. Any public comment, Shelley?
Not seeing any for this item at this time.
Okay, we'll get right on to our next item, AB 1874 on page 238. This bill would allow an unlicensed contractor to advertise to perform construction work if the value of the labor for the project is less than $500 without considering the cost of materials and other items. The staff recommendation on page 239 is to oppose this bill. There is also some additional history on page 239 about two similar bills the board has voted on in the past. Mike, can you explain?
Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair. This bill was heard in Policy Committee yesterday as well, and it actually failed passage. There was not a request for reconsideration made on site, so this usually means the bill is dead. However, to be safe, from a staff perspective, I don't think it would hurt if the board took a position either way on this matter, just so that it's in the record, just in case something happens with this bill, which I think is probably remote. If the board does take a position today, I would just mention that staff probably would not send a letter because it's not moving. So the position probably wouldn't be communicated, but it's just a matter of whether the board wants to take a position on this. With that, I will turn it back to Mr. Committee Chair or answer any questions.
All right, thank you. As I mentioned, the staff recommendation is that the board oppose this bill. This would include the authority for staff to communicate this position in written letters and public testimony. Of course, you have Mike's comment on that already. At this time, we'll entertain a motion and a second.
Michael Mark, make the motion to go with staff recommendation.
Okay, Michael and Mary, is there any board comment on this? Shelley, anything from the public?
Not seeing any requests at this time.
Okay, Mariah, will you please call the roll?
Susan Granzella,
Aye.
Frank Altamura, Rodney Kobos, excused absence, David De La Torre, Miguel Galarza, Don Giratano,
Aye.
Alan Guy, Diana Love,
Aye.
Michael Mark,
Aye.
Steve Pinelli, Jim Ruane,
Aye.
Johnny Simpson,
Aye.
Mary Teichert. Motion passes.
Thank you, Mariah. Next is AB 2105 on page 240. This bill requires CSLB to grant a 50% fee reduction for an initial license to an applicant who has served as an active duty member of the Armed Forces or California National Guard and was honorably discharged. This bill is consistent with CSLB's continued practice of assisting past and present military personnel and their spouses or domestic partners with application and licensing documentation. As the board packet indicates, this bill had its first hearing before the board could review the bill, so staff worked with the board chair and I to submit a support letter to the legislature. Mike, please provide an update.
Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair. And first, thank you to you as well as our board chair for helping staff get this support letter out in time for the hearing. The bill is otherwise basically as described, but obviously there's a fiscal impact that is important for the board to be aware of. It's less than $100,000 in revenue per year based on the number of requests we would get for this. But as you know, our fees were increased recently, so that certainly helps. CSLB can report that the bill passed Policy Committee yesterday on consent, actually, and is on its way to appropriations. Back to you, Mr. Committee Chair.
Thank you, Mike. This, once again, is an update only. No action is required of the board. Any comments from board members? Seeing none. Anything from the public, Shelley?
Anything at this time?
Thank you. Our next item is AB 2374 on page 242. This bill increases various criminal penalties for illegal dumping, including authorizing a criminal court to require a person convicted of illegal dumping to surrender a license issued by CSLB for the duration of the term of probation. Mike will provide us a review of this bill and explain the staff recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair. As you heard at the top of the agenda during the accomplishments and activities update, and as you probably recall, for those of you on the board at the time, CSLB did sponsor a bill last year that made illegal dumping of construction debris a cause for disciplinary action. So this bill would actually change the penal code section, the criminal section for illegal dumping. So it's not a CSLB law. However, the bill currently mentions CSLB as well as any other BCA board, anyone who has a professional or business license that is caught dumping under that penal code section. It gives the court, the criminal court, some discretion on dealing with that professional's license. So staff recommendation is support merely because the bill aligns with the CSLB sponsored illegal dumping bill to the extent it is contractors that are doing this dumping. Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair.
Thank you, Mike. As Mike said, the staff recommendation is the board support this bill. We would include the authority for staff to communicate this position in written letters and public testimony. At this time, is there a motion and a second?
So moved.
That was Susan moved, and who was the second?
Diana Love.
Diana Love. Okay, Susan and Diana. Any board comment on this? Anything from the public, Shelley?
Not seeing any hand raises or requests for comment in the Q&A or chat at this time.
Thank you. Mariah, will you please call the roll?
Susan Granzella,
Aye.
Frank Altamura.
Aye.
Rodney Kobos, excused absence. David De La Torre,
Aye.
Miguel Galarza, Don Giarratano,
Aye.
Alan Guy, Diana Love,
Aye.
Michael Mark,
Aye.
Steve Pinelli, Jim Ruane,
Aye.
Johnny Simpson, Mary Tykert.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you, Mariah. Next is AB 2894 on page 243. This bill requires a licensed contractor, if they have workers' compensation insurance, to inform CSLB of their workers' compensation classification code and requires CSLB to post that information on its website. Mike, a little information on this, please.
Committee Chair. So right now, as you all know, licensees have to report certain information to the board to be publicly displayed, whether they have comp, whether it's current, the fact that they have a bond on file, and maintain the status of those documents in addition to, of course, a number of different other licensing information that is committed displayed to the public. So this bill would include in that information that a licensee has to report to CSLB a workers' compensation classification code. That code is not something that CSLB regulates. So I'm going to describe what is in the author's fact sheet for the bill for any board members that may not be aware of this workers' compensation code. It is used by contractors to obtain workers' compensation coverage and by insurance companies to provide that coverage. And it's based on the type of work performed by the contractor. So there's a rate associated or a cost associated with that code, and it varies obviously by the type of work the contractor performs. According to the fact sheet, the concern that led to this bill is that some contractors misclassify those employees to receive lower rates, which results in, of course, obtaining improper coverage, workers' comp coverage for the employees, and also results in an unfair advantage to cheaters. That is what is in the fact sheet. As far as CSLB goes, according to staff's reading of the bill would simply require CSLB to publicly report that code, as we do so much other information, as reported by the licensee. So this bill is up for hearing in Policy Committee next week. And thank you, Mr. Committee Chair.
Thank you, Mike. Staff has not made a recommendation on this bill, as Mike said, which amounts to a watch or neutral or no position. As a result, this is an update only and no action is required of the board unless a board member makes a motion. Anything from the board?
Chair Ruane, this is Michael Mark. I do have a question on this specific bill. See if I can get my video working. Um, so maybe Chief, you could help me. Is this information already like, does CSLB already keep this information?
No, currently what's required as a condition of a contractor's license with regard to employees is you file a workers' compensation certificate, like a certificate of workers' comp, if you claim to have employees, or an exemption from the workers' comp laws if you claim to have no employees. So what's on the standard certificate of workers' compensation insurance is the date of coverage, when it's going to elapse or expire, and dates, and the insurer and the broker. It's just standard form that is used in the industry. There is not a box on that form for this classification code. So CSLB would either rework that form, or it's, the way it intakes information to include this classification code, or we'd find another way for licensees to report it if this bill were successful.
Is there any benefit for like a public user? Let's say a contractor's unscrupulous and something happens on their property and the contractor is not paying the proper workman's comp rate. That way it'd be public information so the consumer knows that the proper workers' comp is utilized by that contractor working on their house. Would that be beneficial to the public for this?
I think I wouldn't want to speak for the sponsors, but the fact sheet definitely indicates that reporting this classification code to the public in the same way that other contractor license information is reported would be beneficial, for the reason I think you stated.
Anything else, Michael?
That answers my question. Maybe you can clarify why there was a neutral position then, if there was a benefit to the public.
I think staff wants the opportunity for the board to weigh in on whether this, I think the issue somewhat for CSLB is that we don't regulate misclassification of workers, and premium fraud and that sort of thing, and cheating. You either indicate you have employees with us or you don't, and we don't get into the details of your payroll. So this bill would require reporting information as it relates to your workforce, and so just have the board weigh in, and I'm trying to find the statement in the fact sheet to really hone in on your question here. Yeah, the fact sheet indicates that the CSLB license lookup tool shows whether or not a company carrying workers' compensation insurance policy, but does not indicate the 4-digit workers' comp code associated with obtaining the policy. And so I think the sponsors, who are the District Council of Iron Workers, believe that it would be beneficial to include this workforce information along with the licensing information that has to be reported to the board. I hope that answers your question. And I invite Mr. Fote to weigh in if he has any thoughts on this as well.
Of thoughts. One is, I think it's helpful always to have information available to the public, but I'm not aware of any consumer harm that's occurred because of a contractor that's not accurately reporting to his insurer the type of workers that he or she is employing. So I think that's, the concern that we had when we discussed this bill is that we really need the construction employers to weigh in. This is another obligation for them to make sure that when they're filing, they're reporting the workers' comp, that they're accurately reporting the workers that they currently have and keeping that up to date. And so without knowing if the different construction employer associations are in favor of this, it seemed to reach to recommend that it be supported. It's just another employer obligation they have to comply with. And I was also a little bit concerned what would happen if somebody obtains a policy and for the purposes of initially obtaining workers' comp, reports that they have only clerical work, but subsequently they hire staff to go out in the field. I know from prior experience that you have 12 months to report to your insurance carrier a change in the workforce, the number of employees you have. So without having the information available to us from the different employer groups, we were reluctant to recommend a support, but that is why we put or recommended neutral at this time. Thank you.
I would also state on top of that, that as we read the bill, it doesn't require anything further of CSLB than to report the information. And so as the board is probably aware, when the licensees report information to us about their workers' comp and policy details and all of that, the licensing staff processes that document for the benefit of the public, but there's no investigation of the licensee's workforce or the details of their employment unless there's a consumer complaint or something like that. So that's to say that this classification code, we would accept it and display it, but there wouldn't be a processing to investigate the accuracy of it from the CSLB's standpoint.
Probably a lot of my questions.
Okay, and I think a lot of the enforcement part of it is going to stem from the audits that occur between the insurance companies and the workers' compensation appeals board. A lot of that's going to get fleshed out pretty quickly, because it'll be pretty obvious in the audits as to who's doing what and who's not doing what. So I think to put it on the license is fine, but it's just another thing the contractor has to do. And assuming the CSLB has no enforcement in that particular realm, it's like I said, I'm neutral on it. Anyone else from the board like to speak on this? Have a question?
Well, I would, because normally when many of these things start, there's always a consideration on the impact of the staff. What is the time that will be involved? What do they actually do with that information? And that's always a consideration that affects our neutral support or not support some of these. So I would say that we need some more information about this. And, further down the road, if they are submitting the information on the workers' compensation code incorrectly, how does that impact their license? And many other questions that are always involved when we add a new layer of monitoring, really, if you will, for CSLB. So I just wanted to add that.
Good. Anyone else?
Yeah, Alan Guy here. Yeah, it's my understanding with this that you report multiple codes as a business. So there wouldn't be just one code for a contractor. So I'm not sure what adding one or multiple to the license website, because you could still misreport, which doesn't sound like it's a contractor state license board issue, as was previously mentioned.
Anyone else? Shelley, anything from the public?
We did have a hand raised, but that hand is, yes, we do. Eddie Bernacci sent you a request to unmute your microphone.
Thank you. Eddie Bernacchi with Politico Group, representing a plethora of different union signatory contractors association. I would just like to add, we're working with the sponsors on this bill to determine what that reporting would look like. As board member Guy pointed out, are we looking at each employee that we hire out in the field to the board, or are we talking about which classifications we report our insurance carrier in a broad fashion? So I think to Registrar vote's point, we want to continue to look at this bill, and we probably would come back to the board with some more information as we get further clarification from the sponsors on it.
All right, great, thank you. So Michael, keep us posted on any future developments on this.
100%.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, Shelley, from the public?
Richard Markison, I saw your hand was up. Did you have a comment on this one, or I want to make sure that you lowered your hand and not there wasn't a problem with WebEx? Okay, he's good to go. We are clear.
All right, thank you. We'll go on to our next item, which is Senate Bill 1237 on page 244. This bill provides that the Department of Consumer Affairs agencies, which would include the CSLB, waive the renewal fees of a licensee or registrant who is stationed outside of California and is called to active duty as a member of the Armed Forces or California National Guard. This bill is consistent with CSLB's continued practice of assisting past and present military personnel and their spouses or domestic partners with application and licensure documentation. The staff recommendation is support. Mike, how about an update?
Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair. Not much to add on this other than what's in the packet. Other than just to mention, the packet lays out the different options that are available for licensing boards to assist the military and family population with their licensing documents. And we just want to point out for the board here, there's already an existing law, a requirement to waive renewal fees for licensees called to active duty. And for your information, CSLB has received very few of these in recent years. With all of that said, like Mr. Chair stated, it's consistent with our current process. So that is why there's a recommendation. And thank you. Back to you, Mr. Committee Chair.
All right, thank you, Mike. The staff recommendation is that the board support this bill, and this would include the authority for staff to communicate this position in written letters and public testimony. At this time, I'll entertain a motion on this bill.
Make that motion.
This is Diana. I'll second it.
Okay, Johnny Simpson, Diana Love, second. Any board comment on this? Okay, Shelley, any public comment?
Hand raises or requests in the chat or Q&A at this time.
Please call the roll.
Susan Granzella,
Aye.
Frank Altamura, Rodney Kobos, excused absence, David De La Torre, Miguel Galarza, excused absence, Don Geritano,
Aye.
Alan Guy, Diana Love,
Aye.
Michael Mark, Steve Pinelli,
Aye.
Jim Ruane, Johnny Simpson,
Aye.
Mary Tykert. Motion passes.
All right, thank you, Mariah. Next is Senate Bill 1443 on page 245. This bill changes the statutory sunset date of the CSLB from January 1st, 2024 to January 1st, 2025. Mike, how about an update?
Chair. So many of the board members are aware of CSLB's sunset review by the legislature every 4 years. The boards and bureaus are subject to review on their own cycle and statute. And COVID-19 threw off that cycle for the boards and bureaus. So they were all adjusted in their statutes, and CSLB is included in this bill. There's been more than one, along with the dental board, board of accountancy, and architects board, and others. So it's to, my understanding is it's to assist the legislature in managing the sunset review that was delayed by the pandemic. And that is the update. Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair.
All right, thank you, Mike. Staff has not made a recommendation on this bill, which amounts to a watch or staying neutral. As a result, this is an update only and no action is required of the board unless a board member makes a motion. Anything from the board? Okay, seeing nothing. Shelley, any public comment?
Nothing at this time.
All right, thank you. That completes the update on 2021-2022 legislation. Now let's proceed to the CSLB regulatory matters. Item 3, regulations. We are now on page 247 of the packet. For the record, the page numbers that I reference from now on are on the online version of the board packet and not to the first printing of the hard copy packet. The page numbers in the hard copy will be off by a few pages because the first printing of the hard copy did not include the first 2 regulatory items on the agenda. You will note that there are 3 items to be discussed in this part of the packet. The first is CSLB's Code of Regulations, Section 823. The second is CSLB's Code of Regulations, Section 858.2. And the third is Battery Energy Storage Systems. The first regulations item to discuss is on page 249. The item is review, discussion, and possible action by the board to initiate the rulemaking process to make non-substantive Rule 100 changes to Title 16, California Code of Regulations, Section 823. In this item, staff recommends board authority to engage the rulemaking process to make a non-substantive change to one of its regulations, California Code of Regulations, Section 823. This section provides definitions of the words bona fide employee and direct supervision and control for the purposes of responsible managing employees and qualifiers of contractor licenses. The change is necessary because a recent legislative bill, AB 830, passed in 2021, provided new and/or different definitions for these words. The new statutory definitions preempt the regulation, making Section 823 no longer valid. As a result, staff is requesting to repeal the regulation that provides these definitions to clean up the CSLB regulations. The language showing the entire strikeout of this section can be found on page 250 of the online packet. Mike, do you have anything to add?
Nothing substantive. I just want to your update, I just want to make a brief note about the rulemaking process. There are basically three ways to do regulations. It's the regular rulemaking process, the emergency rulemaking process, and then a technical non-substantive rulemaking. And it's that one that we're talking about right now. With that said, I just want to summarize the lengthy staff recommendation on page 250. The first paragraph just allows staff to engage that non-substantive process to change the rule. And then the second paragraph basically says, in case one of the control agencies decides that this is a substantive change, after all, to authorize staff to go through that process. And that's all, Mr. Committee Chair.
All right, thank you, Mike. The staff recommendation can be found on page 251 of the online packet. At this time, is there a motion? Anyone? Okay.
This is Mary Tykert. I'll second.
Moved by Susan, seconded by Mary. Any board comment on this item? Seeing none. Any public comment, Shelley?
Hand raises nor requests in the chat or Q&A at this time.
All right, thanks. Mariah, will you please once again call the roll?
Susan Granzella,
Aye.
Frank Altamura, Rodney Kobos, approved absence, David De La Torre,
Aye.
Miguel Galarza, approved absence, Don Geritano, Alan Guy,
Aye.
Diana Love, Michael Mark,
Aye.
Steve Pinelli, Jim Ruane,
Aye.
Johnny Simpson, Mary Tykert.
Aye.
Motion passes.
The second regulations item to discuss is on page 252. The item is review, discussion, and possible action by the board to initiate the rulemaking process to make non-substantive Rule 100 changes to Title 16, California Code of Regulations, Section 858.2. In this item, staff requests board authority to engage the rulemaking process to make a non-substantive change to one of its regulations, California Code of Regulations, Section 858.2. This section is CSLB's application for licensees who wish to have a blanket bond on file with the CSLB. The section sets forth requirements for the license that the licensee must meet for CSLB to approve the blanket bond. For brief background, a contractor who files with the CSLB what is sometimes called a blanket bond is not required to follow the down payment restrictions on home improvement contracts and may request the full amount of the contract up front. The blanket bond guarantees that they will cover full performance of every contract. The language changes staff is recommending to this form is to a revision date on the form, changing 2011 to 2021, and some grammatical changes which can be found on page 254. Mike, anything to add on this?
Just the exact same summary I provided in the last agenda item. The first paragraph of the recommendation is authority to do the non-substantive change, and the second paragraph is in case it becomes substantive. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Staff recommendation is on page 253, and at this time I'll entertain a motion and a second.
Motion.
Second, Michael Mark.
Johnny Simpson and then Michael Mark. Thank you. Any board comment on this? Anything from the public?
Yes, we have a request for comment from Lourdes Oliva. I've sent the request to unmute your microphone.
Just a clarifying question. So this language will include now the solar industry for these revisions, right?
The regulations that we're discussing right now, Lourdes, do not mention the solar industry. They apply generally to all licensees.
And with that, I do not see any other requests for comment.
All right, thank you. Roll call, Mariah, please.
Susan Granzella,
Sorry. Aye.
Frank Altamira, Rodney Kobos, approved absence, David De La Torre, Miguel Galarza, approved absence, Don Geritano,
Aye.
Alan Guy, Diana Love,
Aye.
Michael Mark,
Aye.
Steve Pinelli,
Aye.
Jim Ruane,
Aye.
Johnny Simpson, Mary Tykert,
Aye.
motion passes.
Thank you, Mariah. And this brings us to agenda item C3, battery energy storage systems, which I will be referring to as BESS. Before we start, I just want to say a special thanks to Susan Granzella, our chair, and Mary Tykert, our vice chair, for all of the efforts they put in to get us to where we are today. I know they had a number of rather lengthy meetings with the people that are involved. So thank you very much. We are now on page 257 of your hard copy packet. Before we begin discussion on this item, I'd like to provide a summary on the board's actions to date on this topic. In 2018, the board began looking at the proper classifications to install BESS. Since 2018, several public meetings have been held, and the board directed staff to prepare a report. In March 2019, the board reviewed the CSLB staff report on energy storage systems and directed staff to begin to develop regulations to present to the board that would prohibit or restrict certain classifications from performing the installation of BESS. The board further directed that this matter be assigned to the Legislative Committee. On August 6, 2019, the Legislative Committee held a meeting and invited 3 industry experts to present on the appropriate classifications to install BESS. Several hours of testimony was heard. On November 7, 2019, the Legislative Committee met again and recommended that the board consider retaining an outside consultant to further study the issue before pursuing regulatory rulemaking. At the December 12, 2019 board meeting, the board agreed with the Legislative Committee recommendation to hire an outside consultant, and staff work with DCA and the Department of General Services to select a qualified consultant to review and make a recommendation regarding the appropriate classifications to install BESS. In December 2020, CSLB entered into contract with UC Berkeley to serve as the consultant. At the July 27, 2021 board meeting, the UC Berkeley consultants presented their completed study to the board. The consultants stated that their conclusion that precluding C46 solar contractors from installing BESS would have significant safety benefits, minimal adverse economic impacts, and benefit the workforce. At that meeting, the board moved and voted to rescind all prior staff determinations that a C46 solar contractor may install battery energy storage systems as incidental and supplemental work, and adopted UC Berkeley's recommendation to preclude the C46 solar contractor from installing BESS in any setting. On September 23rd, 2021, the California Solar and Storage Association, CalSSA, filed a petition for writ of mandate and complaint in the San Francisco Superior Court on the ground that CSLB did not comply with the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, when it moved to preclude the C-46 from BESS installation without going through the formal rulemaking process. At the November 29th, 2021 board meeting, staff presented draft regulatory rulemaking language to codify the board's July 27th, 2021 motion into CSLB's administrative regulations, Title 16, Division 8 of the California Code of Regulations. A description of the development of this issue between the November 29, 2021 board meeting and today begins on page 258 of your online packet. As you may recall, the board did not vote to approve the November 29, 2021 draft language, which would have precluded the C-46 solar contractor from installing BESS in all applications consistent with the UC Berkeley recommendation. Instead, staff was directed to develop alternative language that may be acceptable to the electrical and solar stakeholders, and was further directed to bring the November 29th language back to the board for consideration at its March meeting, if acceptable alternative language could not be developed. The solar classification regulation does not include battery energy storage systems. Therefore, CSLB must add battery energy storage system to the C-46 classification if the C-46 solar classification is to be authorized to install battery energy storage systems. The board packet explains the government code statutes that require state agency-made regulations to be consistent with existing law and informed by facts, studies, and evidence that demonstrate the need for the regulations. Consistent with these requirements, the board packet describes the existing laws and evidence available to the board on this topic, as well as two options for the board to consider before authorizing staff to commence the rulemaking process to add BESS to its regulations. Examples of the existing laws and evidence governing this topic are between pages 263 through 265 of the packet. The pages describe the board's authority to regulate specialty contractors and lay out different building standards codes established by the California Building Commission through their rulemaking process. Examples of such codes described in the packet provide that certain requirements apply when a BESS system or systems have ratings of 20 kilowatt hours or 50 kilowatt hours in groups or 600 kilowatt hours. I will briefly introduce each option before the board today. The first option is on page 267 of your packet. Staff presents for the board consideration the language initially provided on November 29, 2021, which would preclude C-46 solar contractors from installing BESS in any setting. To be clear, this option is included in order to comply with the board's November 29, 2021 motion. However, this option is not staff's current recommendation, which is option 2. The second option is on page 270. Staff presents for board consideration an alternative option that would have the board direct staff to obtain an industry expert within 30 days and for the industry expert to prepare a report which will assist staff in developing draft regulatory text that reflects an appropriate kilowatt hour threshold. The draft regulatory text will be referred to the Legislative Committee for their review in May. The Legislative Committee will consider the draft regulatory text and may make a recommendation to the full board for consideration and possible approval to commence the regulatory rulemaking process. Option 2, staff recommendation, is on page 270. With that, we will open it up to board comment. I would ask for any comments from the board. Anything from the board at all?
This is Diana.
Yes, Diana.
I'm in favor of option 2 for us to continue with conversations between all the contractors involved on both sides. So I'm in favor of option 2.
All right, thank you. Anyone else?
This is Johnny. Where you
Yes, Johnny.
Can we go ahead and make a motion at this time?
Why don't I finish here and I will ask for a motion very shortly.
Okay.
It's all right. Anyone else comments on what I read? Okay. In a moment, I will ask if there is a motion. As previously mentioned, there are two options for the board consideration. Option number 1 is on page 267 of the meeting packet, and option number 2 is staff's current recommendation that is in the packet on page 270. As a reminder, option 1 would authorize staff to proceed with the rulemaking process using the draft language that precludes C46 solar contractors from installing BESS in any situation. Option 2, which is staff's recommendation today, is to direct staff to retain an expert to identify an appropriate kilowatt-hour threshold and draft regulatory text for legislative committee review in May, and to present a recommendation to the full board at the June 2022 meeting. However, as always, any member of the board is welcome to make an alternative motion. At this time, I'll entertain a motion.
This is Johnny. Like to make a motion to accept staff recommendation.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Mary Tykert, I'll second.
Okay, Johnny Simpson and Mary Tykert. Yes.
May I just for the record read what the staff recommendation is, just to make sure we're properly capturing what the board is directing staff to do?
Sure,
That is
Jason,
okay.
please do.
Okay, thank you. So the staff recommendation is as follows: that the board directs staff to take all necessary steps to identify and retain an outside expert to consider best information received, perform additional fact-finding as necessary, and to provide the CSLB an assessment of whether authorizing a C46 solar contractor to install BESS to a kilowatt per hour threshold within 50 kilowatts per hour or another appropriate range supported by existing Title 24 codes is prevalent among the C46 contractors in the construction business and is consistent with ensuring public safety. In addition, the board directs staff to identify the expert within 30 days and direct the expert to return the report within 30 days after CSLB retains the expert. Upon receipt of the expert report, 1, direct staff to provide a copy of the report to stakeholders, and 2, if staff deems it appropriate, direct staff to refer this matter to the legislative committee for a public meeting to invite comment from relevant stakeholders and members of the public on the expert report. Following the legislative committee and any additional stakeholder meetings staff deems appropriate, draft regulatory language consistent with the expert report and provide any additional relevant input provided and present it to the board at the quarterly June 2022 meeting.
Thank you, Jason. And before we get into public comment, just one quick item. We did receive some correspondence early this morning from one of the stakeholders, and I just want to remind people, as a reminder, the purposes of today's meeting, the board is not being asked to establish a threshold limit. Option number 2 would direct staff to identify and retain a subject matter expert, and the document would then be shared with this expert should option 2 be the direction of the board. So we're not asked to establish a threshold today. We want to give it to industry expert and see what they come up with. So having said that, I'll ask for public comment. And as we discussed earlier, we are limiting public comment to 2 minutes, please.
Committee Chair Ruin, I have a
Yes.
quick question on
Michael.
that.
Sorry. Any other board comments, Michael?
So make sure I'm hearing correctly. The expert will be hired within 30 days, and then a report will be back to the staff and to the board, and then it'll go to the stakeholders, and then the actual rulemaking and language will be at our next board meeting in June.
My understanding. Jason, is that correct?
That's my understanding, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anything else from the board? Okay, ask for public comment. And as I said earlier, we're limiting to 2 minutes, please. Shelley, would you please check for public comment?
Yes, our first request comes from Suzanne Lita. Suzanne, I've sent the request to unmute your microphone.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, great. Thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to confirm. I'll speak briefly. This is Suzanne Lita. I am Senior Director and Head of Policy and Strategy at SunPower. I really want to thank the board for voting to further study this issue. I think that's the right approach. For those of you that are not familiar with SunPower, we've been in business for more than 36 years. We're a leading solar battery storage and energy services technology provider in across the United States, in all 50 states, and in California. We work with over 300 small businesses across California to install our systems on residential homes. And we have more than 140,000 customers to date in the state. I just want to emphasize, moving forward as you study this issue further, the importance of recognizing that system sizes for battery storage are growing over time. So we started with a 13 kilowatt hour system, and just earlier this week, we announced a 26 kilowatt hour system and a 52 kilowatt hour system. And it's because our customers are seeking solutions that can really provide whole home battery backup. So I'd just like you to keep considering that with respect to the residential market as you study this issue further. And then the other challenge that we're facing is available workforce. That includes licensed staff of all kinds, but also electricians. There's just a lack of available workforce in general in California right now. It's a big challenge for our own direct employees as well as those small businesses we work with. So just please keep that in mind as well. Thank you so much.
Our next comment comes from Bernadette Del Cairo. Bernadette, I've sent the request to unmute your microphone.